Government agencies opened their books to the House of Representatives Finance Committee for scrutiny. I'm Linda Akibe, and you are welcome to the Gavel. The House of Representatives Committee on Finance has been meeting with the heads of various government ministries, departments and agencies to discuss the Medium-Term Expenditure Framework (MTEF) and Fiscal Policy Paper (FSP). Now, these planning documents, which cover the next 3 years, is a major feature of the annual budget preparation cycle and provides the basic estimates and assumptions for the annual budget. The planning documents also provide guidance to federal government MDAs in the formulation of policies and selection of projects and programs to ensure economic development. Now, the Minister of Finance made a presentation on the first day of the meeting and once again reminded us that the country is still grappling with acute revenue shortages and deficit budgets running into trillions of naira.
Right Honorable Speaker, members of the House, permit me to give you an update of the 2021 revenue performance. The gross oil and gas revenue for 2021 was projected to be 5.19 trillion naira. As of June, the sum of 1.85 trillion naira was realized out of the prorated sum of 2.59 trillion. This represents 71.3% performance. Oil and gas deductions amounting to about 320 billion naira. That is about 62.9% more than what we had projected in the budget. This is mainly attributable to petroleum subsidy cost, which was not provided for in the 2021 budget. After netting out deductions, including 13% derivation, net oil and gas revenues inflows to the Federation account amount to 1 trillion and 200 billion naira. This is 1.063 trillion or 51% less than the projections as at June 2021. Let me also give you a further brief overview on the fiscal outcomes relating to the Federation account as well as the VAT pool accounts as they are distributed. The amount that has been available for distribution from the Federation account is 2.41 trillion. Of this amount, the federal government received 1.268 trillion, while the state governments and the local governments received 643 billion and 493 billion respectively from the main pool account. Federal, state and local governments received 138 billion, 460 billion and 322 billion respectively from the VAT pool account. Recall that the federal government receives only 15% of VAT revenue. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to report to you now briefly of some of the fiscal outcomes in terms of the budget implementation for 2021. On revenue performance, as at June 2021, the federal government retained revenue of 2.23 trillion, representing 67.3% of the prorated target. Federal government share of all revenues was 492 billion, representing 49% performance, while non-oil tax revenue totaling 778 billion, representing an overperformance of 104.5% compared to the prorated target. Companies' income tax, value-added tax collections were way ahead of the budget, with 397 billion, 128 and 129 billion respectively, representing 116.5% and 108.2% respectively of the prorated targets. Customs collections was 234.02 billion, representing 92.1% of the prorated target. Other revenues amounting to 922 billion, of which independent revenues is 558.13 billion. Let me now report on the deficit and the financing items for the budget, as well as some critical ratios that should be of interest to the public. The total fiscal deficit that we had in the 2021 budget is 4.891 trillion. This is slightly higher than the 4.64 trillion that we are projecting in 2022. So when you look at the MTEP, you find that the deficit is beginning to decline from 2022 right through to 2023 and 2024. The total fiscal deficit, when you bring in the 60 government-owned enterprises that are in the budget, will rise up to 5.61 trillion. This deficit, excluding government-owned enterprises, represents 2.52% of the GDP, while if you include the deficit of the government-owned enterprises, it is adjusted to 3.05%. What is significant here, Honorables, is that we have tried to come back to the 3% that is allowed by the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And also in subsequent years, the deficit reduces on a significant basis in the outer years of 2023 to 2024.
We just listened to the finance minister talk about the nation's worrying revenue shortage and plans by the federal government to borrow as a means of financing the deficit. Now, following these remarks by the finance minister, the House of Representatives Committee on Finance for 4 days during the week scrutinized the income and expenditure profiles of various government agencies to block leakages and increase revenue for critical infrastructure. On the first day of this interactive session by the House of Representatives, the Minister of Finance spoke about the nation's worrying revenue shortage and plans by the federal government to borrow as a means of financing the deficit.
The total fiscal deficit, when you bring in the 60 government-owned enterprises that are in the budget, will rise up to 5.61 trillion. We will also be expecting additional financing from privatization proceeds, and also from multilateral and bilateral and project-type loans. And this total financing of 4.893 trillion will be financed by both domestic and foreign borrowers.
At the continuation of discussions on Tuesday by the House of Representatives on the 2022 to 2024 Medium-Term Expenditure Framework and Fiscal Strategy paper, the Finance Committee says it intends to thoroughly scrutinize the capital votes of government agencies to block leakages and increase revenue for critical infrastructure.
We are all aware that revenue is a major problem we have in Nigeria. The proposal before us stipulates 4.9 trillion to be borrowed to be able to make up the 2022 budget proposal. So our job is to see how we can reduce that borrowing by looking inward where possible.
One of the agencies before the committee is the Nigerian Shippers Council. The executive director explains the reason for the shortfall in the revenue of the agency.
It is a custom that actually determines what amounts to that percentage of the port levy. So we are not even involved really in that particular exercise.
Clerk, invite Accountant General's office on the issue of collections by customs, especially the surcharge, the 7% surcharge.
The House of Representatives Committee on Finance continued to meet with government agencies the following day to find solutions to the challenge of revenue shortfall and how to reduce the nation's budget deficit. It scrutinized the income and expenditure profiles as well as capital votes of government agencies for the period 2018 to 2021 with the intention to eliminate frivolous expenditure and examine revenue generated. One of the federal government's critical revenue generating agencies, the Federal Inland Revenue Service, FIRS, was before the committee, and talks shifted to the ability of the agency to meet its revenue targets. The FIRS boss spoke about the introduction of road tax and revenue from social media platforms.
We already have a department called International Tax Department that is handling those cases. Twitter and others are already registering with us, so we are aware, and that is why from a revenue projection of about 5 trillion last year, we are raising the revenue projection to about 10 trillion in the year 2022. So we expect that the impact of those registrations will be fed positively by FRS, and that is why the figures are going up. We are thinking of, which will surely come back to National Assembly on that, is to introduce raw taxes. Raw taxes is necessary because all over the world there is no way you see people that will use road for free. The government is, as it is today, even if you are able to give the entire 10 trillion to government of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, it will not be able to fix the roads in Nigeria alone, just the roads in Nigeria alone. So what we've decided to do is to propose the introduction of road taxes to the federal government through our Special Tax Operations Department in such a manner that informal sector player that will own at least probably 50 trucks and will be plying this road for free. At any given point in time, he comes across the toll gate or probably somewhere that we are going to use electronic device to collect this without necessarily erecting toll gate, he pays taxes, because we are aware the owners of these trucks, they don't do anything with the government, so they don't come near government to get the FRS to get tax clearance certificate. So they will own 15, 20 trucks that will ply the roads that is built with the personal income tax that I pay and you pay, and yet they don't pay taxes. So these are the gap that we want to identify. And these are the few ways we are thinking of bringing the informal sector to TaxNet.
The committee took the FIRS on the indebtedness of the telecoms company, MTN, to the federal government and what the agency is doing to ensure that the company pays up.
It's not just indebtedness, it's avoidance of payments intentionally by MTN. You reviewed and you came up with an outstanding of 451,985,426.86 million naira. Your agency confirmed as MTN is owing Nigeria.
They have been paying by installment some of the liabilities that are yet to be fully settled by them, which is in the region of about 96 billion.
A company in Nigeria that has been declaring profits in trillions will now be holding Nigeria's money to the tune of close to 500 billion. And then you are here telling us that they are going to pay till the end of the year. What is the meaning of that? Why can't they pay?
We finally realized that MTN remitted some of the withholding taxes, but they could not produce evidence.
The House Committee on Finance directed the FIRS to submit the receipts of the payments made by MTN. On the final day of the sitting during the week, members of the House of Representatives Committee on Finance expressed displeasure at the failure of some government agencies to remit generated revenues to the Federation account. It observed the discrepancies in the documents on the income and expenditure profiles submitted by the Nigeria Ports Authority (NPA) and the Nigerian Communications Commission (NCC). Committee members were also displeased that the NPA had a liability of 176.6 billion naira in unremitted revenue as at 2018. The chairman of the committee, Mr. James Faleke, noted that government borrowings would greatly reduce if agencies remit the accurate revenue to the Federation account when due.
For us to do a proper job, the committee has decided to review, to look at your actual performances in terms of your capital for 2018, 2019, and 2020. Actual performances. And then we also take a look at your actual performance on revenue 2018, 2019, 2020. From there, we move on to the new proposal 2022 to 2024. Your performances in those previous years will enable us to decide whether the proposals you have submitted is realistic or not. Bearing in mind that the major problem we have in this country today is lack of revenue.
You're welcome back to the Gavel. In June this year, the chairman of the Senate Committee on Public Accounts submitted the annual report of the Auditor General of the Federation on the accounts of the Federation for the year ended December 31st, 2015 to the Senate. Now, the report detailed several infractions by government agencies, including withdrawal of funds from the executive from special funds accounts for purposes other than what they are meant for, prevalence of unwholesome financial practices by some major revenue-generating agencies, and habitual late or non-submission of financial reports by some MDAs to the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation. We had a chat with the chairman, Senate Committee on Public Accounts, Senator Matthew Rogide, to discuss more about the reports.
The administrators of NNPC are completely aware of the provisions of the Constitution. So one would have expected that, being aware of the provision of the Constitution, there is no other law that is superior to the provisions, in the Constitution. No other law that is superior to the Constitution. So one would have expected that, yes, they know this. And it's a provision that all monies collected must be paid into the Federation account. It's a provision. And out of that, it has to be an out of appropriation by National Assembly that you can spend money from the Consolidated Revenue Fund. So if they say, well, what has set them up empowers them to spend the money, I don't think that one is not a contravention. It is a contravention.
Do you think anything would change as regards the infractions by the NNPC? Where do we go from here?
Let me say this. Today, the hope that Nigerians have, and in fact, even that is even reverberating to the outside world, is that we have an administration in place. We have at least a president in place, all right, of this country, that came to power on the matter of anti-corruption, isn't it? On the matter of accountability. This is the first time. Like I said, we have submitted this report to the Senate. Senate has adopted it. For its full implementation, the executive knows that they have to do the needful. Otherwise, it will just be tantamount to mounting this anti-corruption, crusade, that, of course, we are presently engaged. The Senate has done its own now. This is our contribution, huge contribution to the fight against corruption in Nigeria. This is systemic corruption.
Will the National Assembly consider, the option of not appropriating funds for some of these defaulting agencies, maybe when it's time for the consideration of the 2022 budget?
It is very possible. The National Assembly has the powers to do that. In fact, they have put in these time limits. And I know it too that after 60 days, these funds are not recovered. The National Assembly will take the right step. The Senate haven't taken this decision today. I'm quite sure that the Senate will go ahead to take the next step if these agencies are this person's default.
When we talk about funds, could you give us an idea of how much we're talking about in terms of infractions?
For what we have submitted, we have in excess of 1 trillion for 2015. In excess of 1 trillion. Because the infractions, if you put them together, even those ones too that have not been accounted in terms of money. For instance, if we have shares, owned by federal government, they are not listed with CSCS, as we are saying now. It only means that maybe some of these ones really, we are not bought, or they have been stolen, or they are lying somewhere. So these are in billions of naira. All right. So those aspects, just like Senate has recommended, I think you avail yourself of the privilege of having that document. It's not public document. So you look at it, you can have an idea of what we are saying. Because they are very specific. Very specific. Now that they have been, adopted by the Senate.
Now, some of the infractions, in the findings on the report, some of the infractions had to do with withdrawals of funds by the executive from the special fund accounts, which were deployed for purposes not intended for. Some would ask, how could this happen under the watch of a National Assembly? Is it that the National Assembly has not properly oversighted these government agencies?
If we appropriated sums of monies to all these agencies. And the one that were responsible for collection or dedicated accounts created by the executive. Something put into a consolidated revenue fund, for instance. All right? What it means, that fund is for a special purpose. The ones you are referring to, 5% rise levy, 50% with levy, and all other, some other dedicated accounts as you see in that report. Those sums of money were supposed to be kept in a dedicated account for a purpose. This is completely outside of what was appropriated. We have power oversight over those things that is what we see. The Committee on Customs, for instance, will not know outside of personnel, overhead and capital appropriated for them. Or maybe the 7% you give to them, cost of collection. That these levies which they collect, which is paid into the federal coffers, they will not know that the 15% of collections derive from 15% levy. If you bring in rice, you are supposed to pay this levy on it. If you bring in wheat, you pay this levy. That money was supposed to be used for a purpose. And if you go and check, it is to be able to develop rice growing in Nigeria or wheat growing in Nigeria. But rather, do dedicated accounts. What they did was to go there, take the money for something else.
Yes, this is another issue spoken about in the report, the habitual non-submission of financial reports by the Office of the Accountant General of the Federation.
It's a very good observation, and it is one of the recommendations that were made to the Senate as a committee. If you go to Section 85, 3, 4, subsections, it is very clear what the relationship should be. All right? If you check 85.3, it's very clear that it says the Auditor General for the Federation shall submit within 90 days on receipt of the financial statements from the Accountant General of the Federation, submit to the National Assembly. And then the National Assembly shall commit that report to the Public Accounts Committee in the two houses for consideration. That way it stops. If you see that provision, what it means is that once the Auditor General gets the financial statement, that is the first part, that we had in our report. The second part of our report. That federation account and financial statement. So that financial statement comes constitutionally, comes from the Accountant General. So it's the Accountant General that has presided over distribution of funds. And as he has distributed the funds, all these agencies, when they bring in their own accounts, whether it's management accounts or whatever, they bring them to him. He consolidates them. And then that financial statement is what it takes to the Auditor General, who now looks at them. He audits them, and that is what he sends. That's what he sends to us. That provision, it limits the Auditor General 90 days. You must bring to National Assembly. But nothing limits the Accountant General. No time limit. So any time he prepares the financial statement, he takes it to him. Oftentimes he will tell you he has not consolidated his account, so I can't send it to you. Mind you, the Auditor General is limited by time. That is why audit reports don't come to us in National Assembly, because there's always delay from the Office of the Accountant General.
This is where we call it a day on this week's edition of The Gavel. If you have any views on any of the issues discussed, please email us on thegavel@channelstv.com. Thank you for staying with us, and see you again next week.